Other Worlds and Their Stories by J. Riley Peake. Copyright 2017 by SC TreeHouse. All rights reserved. Stories by J. Riley Peake. Illustrated and edited by Christopher D. Stewart. Narrated by Heidi Olson. Dedication from the editor. For my best friend Riley, you made this book possible, but only because you didn't finish the other one I planned to publish. And for Kimberly, you made a good double agent during the publication of this. Introduction. The question regarding whether or not other planets share Earth's unique ability to rear life is a question many ask. However, because men much smarter and, consequentially, more handsome than I have undertaken this very thing to no avail, I resign myself to the idea that I must leave such a search alone. Despite my lack of credentials in this field, though, there is, in fact, another discussion to which I can speak. For I can speak of worlds, and why bother talking about planets when one could speak about worlds? From the time humanity first filled its lungs with breath, we have looked to the skies for other worlds. It has only been recently that the smartest of men thought to look down instead of up. Indeed, I myself have discovered worlds both above and below. The problem is not where they're looking. It's what they are using to look with. You can't observe them with your eyes. You can't see the scent of a rose, nor can you watch the internal shattering of someone's heart. Like sound or emotion, there are indeed other worlds. Ones both deep, dark, and mysterious, as well as light, high, and hopeful. Both the smell of a flower and the throes of despair are real experiences. We just don't see them with our eyes. Story 2. Fortune's Veil. With a grunt, the young man stood to his feet and stretched, observing his surroundings as he did so. He was standing on the shale-strewn banks of a river in the bottom of a low valley. The land looked ravaged by war, upturned and riddled with many holes all along the valley. The young man gazed up and down the valley, assessing the abundance of this destruction. Quite a bit for one day, he thought. Of course, he had to concede that he hadn't done it all on his own. There were many others digging in this valley. The dull, reverberating tempo of their tools echoed throughout the hills, bearing witness to their presence just around the bend. It was the later part of the day here along the American River, and the golden California sun was beating down mercilessly upon the land and all its unfortunate laborers. It was another drought season. "Better get back at it," he said, scooping up his pickaxe and shovel. He proceeded down the bank a ways till he came to what he gauged to be a good spot, and, more importantly, one that would be shaded sooner by the tree line on the valley rim. It was another hot day out here in Fortune's Vale. The young man took note of that as he wiped the sweat from his brow and tossed his shovel to one side. Just one more hole, and then we'll call it a day, he thought. He squared up, hoisted his pickaxe back, and brought it forth in a mighty stroke, plunging it deep into the soil. The action reminded him of chopping wood. However, he felt that the uses of the pickaxe reminded him more of a hoe. As he continued to break up the ground with it, he found his mind drifting back to the home he had left behind, and the events of that last day he had made use of gardening tools. It was the summer of 1851. He, Hoyt Caldale, had been hoeing out the weeds in the garden, and had just started into the corn. The scene was beautiful. The sun shined across the tops of the willowy stalks, and the sky was a deep blue. Hoyt was working with his two younger brothers, Thomas and Buck. Hoyt's younger sister, Jenny, was outside as well. Normally, the boy's sister would be inside helping their mother with chores there, but Jenny had been complaining about feeling rather ill that morning, so their mother had recommended that she go out and get some fresh air while her brothers were tending to the garden. As the siblings had set out, their mother had pulled Hoyt aside and whispered additional instructions to him, telling him to keep an eye on his sister. Now, as Hoyt and his two younger brothers were nearing the end of their task, Hoyt cast his gaze around for his sister. He turned and, looking past his brothers, saw her, lingering on the other side of the field, in the shade of a few oaks. "Do you think she's all right?" asked Thomas, turning to follow Hoyt's gaze. "I don't really know," answered Hoyt. "I fear she's coming down with something." "Yeah, that's for sure," said Buck, the youngest of the family. "Think it's the stomach bug that Howard's sister had last week?" "I don't see how it could be, Buck," answered Thomas. "Jenny ain't been anywhere near Howard's sister." The two younger brothers, now completely distracted from the hoeing, continued to debate what the illness could be. Hoyt turned to scold them back to work, but his words caught in his mouth as, looking past his brothers, he was just in time to see Jenny collapse to the soft green grass. The brothers had rushed to their sister, and Hoyt had carried her to the house, while the younger two swiftly ran for the doctor. The boys had returned with Dr. Crowner just as Hoyt finished explaining to his mother what had happened. While the doctor and Mrs. Caldale tended to Jenny, the boys had waited outside, waiting distractedly for any news. Then Mrs. Caldale had come out on the porch and asked Hoyt to come inside with her and the doctor. Hoyt obeyed, and was soon sitting in the living room with his mother and Dr. Crowner. "Dr. Crowner says it doesn't look good," began Mrs. Caldale, taking a shaky breath. "He says it's not just some kind of bug. It's a long-term illness, and a serious one. He said that, without treatment, Jenny could—" She broke off, her voice choking. "Hoyt," said Dr. Crowner, taking up for Mrs. Caldale, "your sister is in danger." "Isn't there something we can do?" asked Hoyt. "There is," said the doctor. "However, it's expensive. I've been talking it over with your mother, and here's the dilemma. You can cover the first dose of this treatment, but when the second one is needed, you won't be able to afford it." "So you'll let her die because we can't pay you?" interjected Hoyt, a cold spark in his eyes. "It's not that, Hoyt," the doctor said gently. "The problem is that I can't afford the medicine without that pay. You know my family doesn't have much either." The doctor waited till Hoyt backed down before beginning again. "As I was saying, I and Mrs. Caldale have been discussing the issue, and we think we've found a solution. However, Hoyt, since your father has passed away, leaving you as the man of the household, I'm afraid the brunt of this task will fall on you." "Name it," said the young man, a determined air settling about his features. "Very well," said the doctor, nodding his approval. "You're to go to California. They say men have already dug fortunes out of that land, and they're still finding more. That would be just the thing we need." "But how could that work?" asked Hoyt. "Well, the vaccine I will give your sister will not require a second dose for another year," said Dr. Crowner, "meaning you have that long to strike gold and bring it home." The doctor allowed that to sink in before beginning again. "Now, there are several ways to get to California, but only one will meet our schedule. You are to sail down through the Caribbean and cross in the jungles of Panama, then sail on to California, arriving there in 1 month if all goes smoothly." "And how am I to pay for that?" asked Hoyt. The doctor smiled. "I have a fellow who owes me for a past favor, and he just so happens to own a ship. I believe he could arrange for you to work your way over." And so, 1 week later, Hoyt and Dr. Crowner stood upon the quays around the moored vessel Providence. As Hoyt prepared to board, the doctor grabbed his shoulder and pressed something into his hand. Hoyt was shocked to find it was a wad of cash. "I thought you said you and your family were in it rather tight," Hoyt said with skepticism. "I did, and we are," stated the doctor. "That," he said, pointing at Hoyt's hand, "is from the whole town. I didn't tell your mother that you will have to pay when you change ships after crossing Panama. That cash is for securing that voyage, and perhaps enough to barter your way onto a ship quickly. Guard it with your life." Night was coming upon Fortune's Vale, and Hoyt figured it was time to head back to camp. He gathered up his tools and began the long, weary hike. Upon entering the camp, Hoyt was greeted by the usual scene. Men talking loudly of their homeland, others who had been at strong drink were talking loudly of nothing at all, and another group used their weathered instruments to strike up a bouncy tune, to which several men danced around. It seemed a scene of merriment, and matched the glamorized images that many young men came over here bearing in mind about the prospector's life. But Hoyt had been here long enough to see right through the surface of this facade. These men engaged in this all-in sort of gaiety simply to hide from the emotion they really felt, bitter loneliness. This pseudo-joy, however, wasn't the only emotion running high at that time. From the other side of the camp, an angry voice could be heard. Hoyt looked through the crowd and saw the source of this discontent, a pair of men. One of the fellows seemed to believe that the other had stolen from his tent and was very vociferous about his dislike of this. The other seemed to be replying with equally voluble phrases, until the first fellow decided it prompt to oblige his acquaintance to be silent, which he did with a smart punch to the nose. Hoyt grimaced at the blow, his hand drifting involuntarily to his own nose, as the scene brought to his mind another memory of the past. The work upon the Providence had not been hard. Hoyt primarily worked around the dining room of the ship, cleaning tables and washing dishes. He had been doing this for several days with no trouble, but then, one evening, as he was leaving the kitchens, Hoyt walked out of the kitchens and bumped straight into a solid wall, which, upon closer inspection, he realized was a man. "Thought you could get away with it, eh?" growled the man, his accent denoting him as a man from the north. "With what?" asked Hoyt, fully aware that he was looking up at the man. The man didn't even seem to register the question. Instead, he continued his steady growl. "One moment my pocket watch is on the table, then you come by to clean a table and the watch disappears." A crowd of interested bystanders was now gathering. "What are you trying to say, sir?" asked Hoyt. "Thievery ain't taken lightly," roared the man. Hoyt saw, but was not swift enough to dodge, the sledgehammer fist aimed straight at his face. It lifted him off his feet and threw him to the floor in a crumpled heap. "Check him!" the man grunted to a few fellows standing around. "He should have my watch in his pockets." Hoyt, in his dazed state, was only dimly aware of the men checking his pockets. "No watch, but he does have this," he heard one of the men saying. Must have hid it in the kitchens," said the hulking individual. "However, I'll consider this as repayment for his crimes. Hand it over." Hoyt was wondering what the man could have found in his pockets, then felt his heart jump into his throat as he realized what it was. Opening his eyes, he found he was correct. The man had the roll of cash that Dr. Crowner had given him. "Give that back," groaned Hoyt, getting shakily to his feet. The man cast a disdainful eye at Hoyt. "I'm sure you could get enough from selling my pocket watch," he said. "Give it back," Hoyt repeated, trying hard to get some steel in his voice. "Oh, look out, Victor. I think the lad's gonna come after you," said someone in the crowd. "Yeah, best guard your pockets. He might take something else," called another. The colossal northerner put the wad of cash into his pocket and smiled at Hoyt, though Hoyt noted it wasn't a kind sort of smile. "Come on, lad. I'll break every bone in that thieving hand of yours." Hoyt swallowed dryly as he stood before the towering figure of Victor. By this point, he had decided that the man must be a lumberjack, whose job was either to simply push trees over with his hulking frame, or to clear the logged land by pushing the stumps into the ground with his little finger. Hoyt was scared and still dizzy from the last blow he had taken. However, Hoyt was also a headstrong 24-year-old farm boy who never really thought such things all the way through. Thus, the first fist was thrown without a second thought. Victor easily dodged the punch, stepping back out of the way. Then, the logger stepped in to throw a punch of his own, a massive freight train right hook. This time, Hoyt was ready. He ducked, allowing the fist to sail by overhead, then he awkwardly threw himself back as Victor immediately followed his right hook with a left-handed uppercut. A few enthusiasts, who had joined the crowd around the fighters, caught Hoyt and threw him back onto his feet in the improvised ring that had formed. Victor met Hoyt with another fist, which Hoyt dodged by a desperate dive to the floor. A few fellows on the edges prompted Hoyt back to his feet with a few swift kicks. Once he was back upright, Hoyt tried to go back on the offensive, but Victor slapped his fist dismissively out of the air and sent Hoyt back to the floor with one solid blow to the head. Hoyt was out cold. When he came back to, Hoyt found himself bandaged and lying on a bed. He tried to sit up, but quickly decided that it wouldn't be a good investment. "Well, you're brave, I'll grant you that," said a voice. Hoyt turned and saw a man sitting in a chair by the window on the other side of the small room. He looked to be only a little older than Hoyt. "However," he continued, "I do believe you bit off more than you could chew." "I suppose you could say that," said Hoyt, through a cracked smile, his voice thick. "But it doesn't matter," he sighed. "I lost more than just a fight there." "I noticed that," said the young man, getting up and crossing over to the bed. "And that's why I stepped in. Here, I believe this is yours." And to Hoyt's amazement, the man handed him the money that had come from Dr. Crowner. "My name's Daniel." Hoyt shrugged off the thoughts as he sat down to his meager supper on the edge of the camp. It was his habit to sit out here. using the gorgeous scenery in an attempt to pay as little attention to the vile gruel he was consuming. It was a beautiful landscape. The camp was on the south rim of the valley, and this perch allowed a clear view down the length of the American River. Under the night sky, the river seemed like a strip of liquid silver, flowing off towards some crystal sea. The dark face of the sky was freckled with many brilliant stars, causing it to blush a clear white light. Hoyt took a deep breath of the clean night air and wondered if these were the same stars he had watched from his home. It was comforting to think that perhaps here was one thing that tied him back to the place he had left. Finishing his meal, Hoyt decided it was time to seek out a few hours of sleep. He rose from his position and, casting one look over the luminous valley and the star-speckled sky, made his way back into the camp. Hoyt's tent, like the majority of all the others in the camp, was a simple one-man structure made from a pine branch frame, a few homemade stakes, and a tattered sheet. He crawled into the structure and threw his boots over to one side, with his other meager possessions. Hoyt pulled out a grubby piece of paper and a small stub of pencil. The paper had a long list of small boxes, each with a blank line beside it. Several boxes were already marked, most with an X, but a few had check marks within them. Looking over the list, Hoyt sighed and scrawled an X in the next box on the list, scribbling a 0 in the blank beside the box. Another empty day, he thought bitterly. He'd been here over a month and had relatively little to show for it. I don't even have enough to pay my way back home yet, he thought, checking the figures on the list in exasperation. With a sigh, he returned the paper and pencil to their place and stretched himself out on the floor. Despite his troubled mind, Hoyt was soon drifting off to sleep, his subconscious filling with scenes of the past. "Hoyt, come check this out!" It was Daniel calling from the rails of the ship. Over the last 2 days of the voyage, Daniel and Hoyt had spent the majority of their time, when Hoyt wasn't working, together, quickly forming a friendship between the two. Hoyt, who had been mopping the deck, put down his bucket and, mop still in hand, came to see what had excited his friend. As he reached the rail, he saw a green mass rising over the far horizon. "The jungles of Panama," stated Daniel. Suddenly, the scene seemed to shift. Now, Hoyt was on the coast, following the crowd as they entered the jungle. "Stay in close, lads," called the guide from his position in the front. "There's danger of all sorts within these here jungles. Animals, Spanish raiders, and—" He didn't say what the last group was, but instead turned and looked back at the group, saying, "We'll just hope we don't meet them." The group marched into the shadows cast by the dense jungle canopy. Hoyt cast his wary eye all around at this alien world, full of mysterious dangers. It seemed terrifying. The very plants around him appeared to be closing in, and the air systematically split by the shrieks of strange creatures, causing Hoyt to leap in fright. They trekked on and on for what seemed like an eternity. Hoyt felt as though his legs were about to give out, but the guide was still moving along at a brisk pace. If Hoyt stopped, he knew he would quickly be left behind. Thus, Hoyt continued to stumble on. But, despite his efforts, he seemed to be growing slower and slower, finding it harder to stay with the group. It was like he had something weighing him down, but he didn't know what. It was then that Hoyt became aware of a hand upon his shoulder and realized that he was indeed bearing an extra weight. Someone was pulling him back. Afraid, he pushed the hand away and heard a low, troubled moan come from behind him. Turning around, Hoyt felt a coat of ice line his stomach as he saw Daniel, his friend, lying balled up on the ground, unable to move. Hoyt dropped to the ground, calling for help from the front as he did so. The guide was soon there and, with a worried look on his face, gave Daniel a quick examination. After a moment, he uttered a quiet curse and stood to his feet. "It's the Yellow Jack, lad. You won't be saving him," he said, grabbing Hoyt and attempting to drag him back to the group. "We'd best be moving on." "No, that's my friend. You don't understand," cried Hoyt. "You can't leave him." But the guide and the rest of the group seemed to have every intention of doing just that. They continued to drag Hoyt away from his friend. Hoyt resisted, his gaze locked on the writhing figure of Daniel. The forest now seemed to echo with Daniel's low, continuous moan. "It's them!" squawked the guide. "It's the stranded! Run!" Hoyt watched in horror as shaky forms stumbled out of the jungle, all pinched and sickly, pleading for help and rescue. They, like Daniel, had fallen sick and were abandoned in this jungle. Now they sought to latch themselves to any passer-by in the hopes of being brought out from their wanderings. Quaking in distilled terror, Hoyt tore off the grip of his companions who had been dragging him and started to join their flight. However, Hoyt found that his friends had not been dragging him. Instead, he saw 5 pale-faced, moaning Stranded, who had been in the process of dragging him into the jungle. With a cry, Hoyt fled from his would-be captors. As he ran down the trail, hands stretched out on all sides to catch him, but he struggled through them. Hoyt thought he screamed the whole way, but the incessant moaning drowned out all noise. It rang in his ears and pressed him to run faster. Then, Hoyt saw the end. It was gilded in wondrous sunlight. As he reached it, he ventured one last look back and stopped. All was still. The Stranded had disappeared, and in their place was one small figure, unimaginably small against the oppressive backdrop of the jungle. Hoyt's heart seemed to die as he recognized the figure. Jenny. Hoyt awoke with a hoarse cry. He was bathed in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The fabric of his tent glowed with a pale light, telling him that it was dawn. Still trembling, Hoyt sat up and put on his boots. Then he threw open the tent and stepped out into the dawn. Walking over to the edge of camp, Hoyt surveyed the American River Valley. There was a cold mist slithering along the valley. Hoyt stood there shivering, but was uncertain whether he was doing so because of the cool wind that was blowing, or the image of that small figure in the jungle which was still so clear in his mind. Time for another day.